Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal under the blazing morning sun of Port Charles, the golden light did little to warm the icy grief-consuming Michael Corinthos as he stood motionless by the tall windows of the Courtemain boathouse. The city still bore the echo of political unrest and the tremors of personal tragedies that had not yet had time to settle. Yet nothing outside reflected the storm raging within Michael's chest. His heart was shattering, bit by bit, each fragment a silent scream. A father, forced to let go of his infant daughter not out of choice, but out of a desperate act of love meant to save her life. There were no words profound enough to express the agony of that moment, of knowing he could not protect Daisy by holding her close. He had to protect her by letting her go. From the deepest part of his soul, Michael loved Daisy with a devotion that transcended logic or explanation. She was not just his daughter, she was the breath in his lungs, the pulse beneath his skin, the fragile hope tethering him to life amidst chaos. To Sasha and Daisy, Michael had become a lighthouse in a storm-ridden sea, casting light through darkness, unwavering. But he knew too well that his love alone couldn't shield them from the violent reality of a war they had been dragged into, a war waged in silence and blood, where family members were used as pawns, and innocence was the first casualty. There was only one man he could entrust with their safety. Jason Morgan, his uncle, his brother in every way that mattered, and the one man whose name alone still caused tremors in the underground. Jason was forged in the shadows, his life an unending sequence of sacrifices carried out without complaint, without recognition. When Michael asked him to protect Sasha and Daisy, Jason didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions or voice doubts. He simply nodded, his eyes carrying the weight of too many goodbyes. And when the door finally closed behind him, Michael collapsed under the silence that followed, his tears flooding down like rain that could no longer be held back. The sound of Daisy's laughter that he would never hear again, the milestones he would miss, the first smile, the first word, the first step, these all echoed like ghosts in his chest. But to save her, he had to become her absence. Jason understood better than most what it meant to love from a distance. He had made peace with being the ghost in someone else's life, the shadow that watched but never stayed. That night, under a veil of coastal fog, he led Sasha and Daisy out of the boathouse and into the unknown. Sasha clutched Daisy tightly to her chest, singing softly through her tremors, while Jason scanned every corner of the dimly lit street, hyper-aware of every flicker, every sound. His instincts, sharpened by years of surviving ambushes, felt unease crawling beneath the silence. And it was no illusion. Long before they reached the private airstrip, the trap had been set. Jen Sidwell, Sonny's unrelenting nemesis, had intercepted the plan. This time, his assault was not against power or property, it was personal. He had discovered Daisy's existence, recognized her value as leverage, and had resolved to exploit the single most vulnerable spot in Michael's and Sonny's lives. The children. As the SUV veered off the main road onto the final stretch toward the airstrip, Jason's senses flared. The headlights of the tailing car suddenly cut out. Shadows twitched unnaturally in the tree line. Silence fell like a guillotine. Without a second's hesitation, Jason flung open his door, barking for Sasha to hold Daisy and stay low. The windshield exploded in a storm of bullets. The SUV swerved and crashed into a ditch, the front axle snapping with a loud crack. Jason was out before the vehicle came to a full stop, firing into the darkness with practiced precision. The enemy wasn't random. They were trained, armed with military precision. This wasn't a scare tactic, it was an assassination mission. Jason realized they weren't meant to survive this night. Inside the overturned vehicle, Sasha clung to Daisy, stifling her baby's frightened cries with trembling lips. Every whimper pierced her like glass. Outside, blood dripped from Jason's wounds, yet he stood like a sentinel between life and death. His body became the shield that protected the only thing that mattered, the baby asleep in Sasha's arms. A bullet tore through his side, but he kept firing, each shot echoing with purpose, until he threw himself in front of the SUV, intercepting a final hail of gunfire meant for mother and child. Only moments later, the screech of tires signaled the arrival of backup. Sonny's men, called through a fail-safe Michael had insisted on. They drove the attackers into the night, scattering them like phantoms. But the victory came too late. Jason Morgan collapsed in the red glow of the taillights, his final breath escaping in silence. Sasha and Daisy were whisked to safety, but the cost of their survival would never be forgotten. Jason's blood remained on the roadside as a brutal testament to his loyalty. When Michael received the news, his knees buckled at the pier where he had last seen them off. His eyes, once full of hope, now stared into an abyss of sorrow. Jason had been more than family, he had been a piece of Michael's own soul. The debt could never be repaid. And the grief? It would never heal. The entire city of Port Charles mourned. Jason's death sent shockwaves through both the criminal underground and the quiet lives he had touched. Even Sonny, hardened by decades of bloodshed, found himself shaking with fury and sorrow. Sidwell had crossed the final line, he had destroyed the last sacred remnants Sonny had left. The vow was simple, Sidwell would pay. There would be no corner of the earth where he could hide. But grief has a cruel way of breeding more darkness. Still numb from the loss, Sasha returned to her room to check on Daisy, only to be met with horror. The cradle was empty. A gut-wrenching scream tore from her throat, echoing through the house like a siren of despair. Her knees gave out, and her arms reached for air, desperate to grasp the child who was no longer there. Daisy had vanished. The nightmare was only beginning. Michael was already running before Sasha's cry had finished. He burst into the room, eyes scanning the vacant crib. His heart stopped. Every ounce of composure evaporated. The child he had sacrificed so much to protect was gone. Despite every effort, every layer of security, they had failed. Again. Frantic calls were made. The estate was locked down. But Michael knew what the others didn't, this was no ordinary kidnapping. Someone had been watching. For weeks, maybe longer. Watching through windows, waiting for their chance. All eyes turned to Willow, whose mental state had been deteriorating since losing custody of Wiley and Amelia. Whispers swirled, recalling the eerie way she'd lingered outside the nursery, her vacant stares, her sudden disappearances from work. But suspicion alone was not enough. The evidence was thin. And as much as Michael wanted answers, he knew the trail might point elsewhere. Because Sidwell knew about Daisy. And if he knew once, he could know again. The attack on the road had failed. Maybe this kidnapping was his plan B. Sasha could hardly breathe. The walls of the Quartermain estate became a prison, the silence of the nursery a cruel reminder of absence. Every second without Daisy was agony. And Michael, consumed with fury and guilt, vowed the hunt would not end. He had already lost Jason. He would not lose Daisy. He was no longer just a father. He was a force of nature. In a city defined by its secrets and betrayals, by love lost and loyalties tested, Port Charles stood on the brink. Daisy's disappearance wasn't just a family's tragedy, it was a catalyst. Lines would be crossed. Alliances would be forged in blood. And somewhere, in the shadows, a child waited, her cries silent, her world stolen. But she would not be gone forever. Michael would burn the world to bring her home. Michael came running the moment he heard the words, Daisy was gone. The hallway blurred around him, the only sound reverberating in his ears was the pounding of his own heartbeat, thudding with a force that made his chest feel as though it might split open. Panic overtook every fiber of his being. His mind reeled, his breath came in ragged gasps, and the image of the empty crib sent a white-hot wave of terror surging through his bloodstream. He barely made it to the nursery before collapsing to his knees, hands grasping the sides of the cradle as if holding on to the last place where she had existed would somehow bring her back. But there was nothing, No blanket, no bottle, no trace, just a gaping void where his daughter had been, and the chilling realization that his worst nightmare had become real. Michael's body trembled with the weight of raw, unfiltered emotion. A storm of grief, rage, and helplessness crashing over him in relentless waves. He had done everything to protect Daisy. He had sacrificed presents for her safety. He had stood by and let her go, trusting Jason, and Jason had given his life in that trust. And now, despite all of it, the enemy had struck again, not in a blaze of gunfire, but in silence, calculated, merciless silence. Someone had taken Daisy, stolen her away like a shadow in the night while they were still grieving the blood that had already been spilled. He stood up slowly, but something inside him had shifted. His hands clenched into fists. His eyes, still wet with tears, burned now with a deadly focus. He wasn't just a father in mourning, he had become a man on a mission. Michael immediately activated every contact in his arsenal. The Quartermain family's influence, long wielded like a shield of wealth and power, was now a weapon in his hands. The private security teams hired over the years for boardroom wars were now reassigned to street-level reconnaissance. His contacts in the Corinthos organization, in law enforcement, and even in the underground web of Port Charles's darker corners were all pulled into the fold. He called in every favor owed, mobilized every eye and ear. Nothing was too small. No alleyway, no airport hangar, no out-of-state highway would go unchecked. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. All he could see was Daisy's face, her tiny hands reaching for him the last time they were together, the way her eyes had sparkled when she looked up at him, and the terrible, deafening silence that had replaced it. One of the early suspicions fell on Willow. It was a theory few wanted to voice aloud at first. The mother of his other children, the woman he had once loved deeply, now slowly unraveling after losing custody of Wiley and Amelia. She had been emotionally shattered, visibly unstable during court proceedings, and present at the hospital when Sasha had given birth. Her grief had turned inward, then sideways. There had been strange behaviors, unexplained disappearances, and an unsettling moment when she had been found standing outside Daisy's nursery weeks before, staring in through the glass with an expression void of reality. But as more information came in, the theory began to lose weight. Patterns emerged. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment breakdown. The abduction had been planned. There were no signs of forced entry, no disturbances to draw attention. Only silence, the kind honed through military precision. Then came the footage. Security cameras retrieved from the perimeter of the Quartermain estate revealed indistinct shadows, figures moving around the property at odd hours. One of the angles caught what looked like a lens flare, the unmistakable reflection of a telephoto camera. It wasn't just Daisy they were watching. They had been tracking Sasha's every move. From when she walked the garden path at dusk to the exact time she fed Daisy each night. Michael's chest constricted when he saw the footage. He had thought himself vigilant. He had tripled security. And still, somehow, they had outplayed him. Whoever this was, they had planned every second. And the more he pieced together, the more one name kept rising back to the surface like a bloated corpse, Jen Sidwell. Sidwell had already proven his ruthlessness with the ambush that cost Jason his life. That assault hadn't been a final blow, it had only been the opening act. With Jason gone, Michael realized, they were now fully exposed. Sidwell had hit them where it hurt most, and Michael knew with terrifying clarity that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was a power play. A message. A warning. The child had become collateral in a war that had spiraled far beyond territorial disputes or political maneuvering. Sidwell had made it personal. He had made it bloody. Still, as the hours turned to days, Michael refused to give in to despair. Sasha, however, was unraveling. The walls of the estate seemed to close in around her with every moment Daisy remained missing. Her past was being torn open again, her time as a con artist, her manipulative days with Cyrus Renaud, and the trail of enemies she'd left behind. Some speculated that this wasn't just about Michael or Sonny. Perhaps Sasha's past had come back to claim what mattered most to her. Perhaps Daisy was being used to settle old debts, to reopen wounds thought to be long closed. Every name she had ever crossed paths with was back on the table. Old files were reopened. Cold cases were re-examined. And with every avenue, more confusion spread. So many possibilities. So many motives. So much noise. But no answers. Yet, Michael held on to one absolute truth: he would never stop searching. He had once let Daisy go so she could live. Now, he would move heaven and earth to bring her back. He thought of Jason, of the man who had died protecting his family. He felt Jason's sacrifice burn in his chest like fire. And he made a vow to the memory of his uncle, to the silent grave where Jason now lay: I will not fail her again. He didn't care what laws he had to bend. He didn't care how far into the shadows he had to go. He would chase every rumor, threaten every suspect, cross every line. He would bring Daisy home. Even if it cost him everything. In the heart of Port Charles, a storm was rising, not from the hands of criminals or corrupt politicians, but from a father whose grief had been forged into vengeance. The hunt had begun. And Michael Corinthos would not rest until the empty cradle in the nursery was once again filled with the life he had sworn to protect. Deep within the fractured soul of Port Charles, a city forever teetering on the razor's edge between salvation and ruin. Loyalty, love, and death danced a cruel, never-ending waltz. Here, trust was currency, betrayal came dressed in familiar faces, and peace was always fleeting, vanishing just as quickly as it arrived. It was in this storm-tossed landscape that the search for Daisy unfolded, not merely as a rescue mission against an unseen enemy, but as a father's raw and desperate struggle to reclaim the one thing that still tethered him to hope. For Michael Corinthos, this wasn't just a manhunt. It was a pilgrimage through darkness, a test of soul and spirit, a descent into the very shadows that had already stolen so much. Every alley, every backroom, every whispered secret in Port Charles now pulsed with the rhythm of his fury and heartbreak. The streets no longer breathed with the same life. There was something suffocating in the air, something heavy. It wasn't just the weight of Jason's death or the fear of Sidwell's next move. It was the sense that something fundamental had been torn from the city's core. That child, that little girl, born into a world already too cruel, had become more than the daughter of Michael and Sasha. She had become a symbol. A symbol of what had been lost. A symbol of what still might be found. For Michael, every lead was a lifeline, every silence a noose. He followed them with a ferocity that frightened even those closest to him. The smile he once wore around Wiley and Amelia had vanished. The tenderness he once showed Sasha had been replaced by a cold, focused determination that bordered on madness. But beneath the hardened shell was a heart that bled with every ticking second Daisy remained lost. He saw her in every flickering light, heard her cries in the wind outside the nursery window. She was everywhere, and nowhere. And Sasha, broken yet unyielding, refused to let grief consume her. Her trauma had once paralyzed her in life, but this time, it became her fire. She retraced every step, reread every message, rewatched every hospital video, even those too painful to bear. She relived the birth, the fear, the joy, every moment leading up to the disappearance. For a mother, every detail mattered. Every breath counted. Somewhere out there, Daisy needed her, and Sasha vowed she would not let history repeat itself. The city felt it. The pulse of Port Charles had changed. Conversations fell silent when the Corinthos name was mentioned. The once invincible walls of the Quartermain estate now seemed brittle and stained by failure. Neighbors whispered about government corruption, about revenge plots, about secret deals in courtrooms and abandoned warehouses. Nothing could be ruled out anymore. The war had breached the gates, and Daisy had become its innocent prisoner. Even Sonny, long hardened by decades of bloodshed, found himself unable to sit still. He had seen war, he had survived it. But this was different. Jason was gone, Michael was cracking, and now a child's fate hung in the balance. Sidwell had turned their grief into his weapon, and Sonny knew that unless Daisy was found, the fires of vengeance burning in Michael's heart might devour everything they had worked to protect. Still, hope, faint, flickering, fragile, refused to die. Because in the end, this was not just about tracking a kidnapper or uncovering a conspiracy. It was about something far more primal. It was about the sacred bond between a parent and child. About reclaiming stolen light in a world that had become too dim. It was about a father stepping into hell itself, not because he wanted justice, but because he couldn't bear another day without the sound of his daughter's laughter. Michael was no longer hunting. He was searching, for the heartbeat he'd felt against his chest, for the warmth of Daisy's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. For the part of himself that had vanished the moment that crib was found empty. And the city, this bleeding, bruised, unrelenting city, watched. It watched with bated breath as secrets crumbled and alliances shifted. It watched as the forces that had long slumbered beneath its polished veneer began to stir. It watched as the quiet rage of a father became a roar loud enough to wake every ghost buried in its streets. Because Port Charles, no matter how dark it became, had never truly given up on redemption. It had seen too much to believe in innocence, but it had seen enough to believe in miracles.